B-movie is rubbish, packed to the thorax with nonsense and painfully mediocre. It screams attempted classic at every corner. It demonstrates itself to be unwanted and unloved by its creators, giving only the illusion of care and craftsmanship without the required passion to squeeze fun from its paper-thin premise. Its failure to deliver a coherent message, meandering story, bizarre plot developments, and sheer creepiness at times are almost impressive, especially considering the talent and budget they had to work with. This is a kids' movie, I'm told, but it's utterly devoid of the joy you would expect from working incredibly hard towards a silly end product. It's light-hearted in tone, sure, but that doesn't mean it stands up to the task of capturing children's imaginations. Although a literal B-movie probably sounded hilarious when first pitched, the execution is awful. The script is awash with boring B-puns and supposedly self-aware dialogue that never reaches beyond a surface level, and the absence of structure and limitations rob it of any potentially deep observations. I found it groan-worthy most of the time, and the occasional laugh never came from jokes that both children and adults can share. The movie demonstrates that the ability to make jokes does not constitute a sense of humour. Jerry Seinfeld in the lead role was an abysmal casting choice.
That is one nectar collector.
His premier quality of being a funny man really doesn't shine here. His don't give a shit line delivery and lack of zeal for the role makes it, quite simply, a sad watch. He performs the character as if he's performing for his TV show.
This isn't a good fella, this is a bad fella!
You can tell he's relying heavily on his resume to see the movie through. Nearly all of the famous actors give terrible performances. It's a complete hodgepodge of a cast. Expensive for the sake of being expensive, it lacks any kind of cohesion. Oprah Winfrey's talent clearly does not lie in voice acting. Moreover, it's a blatantly and then this happens kind of story. When you watch a good movie, you form expectations about what's going to happen next that are subverted over the course of the film. The plot should be a pleasant surprise. With this avant-garde masterpiece, you're never even given the opportunity to form expectations before the movie just makes up some stupid bullshit and continues unabated.
Almost done? Almost. He is here. I sense it.
The storyline is as illogical as it is difficult to follow. None of the events feel like an organic consequence of the premise, and yet you're never surprised either. Barren, unexciting, and devoid of love, The Hive isn't the visually diverse, bustling mess it could have been. It opts for suburbia as this animated B story's main setting. The fact the Bs use cars highlights the lack of willingness to look beyond established norms or act with imagination, simply grafting middle-class American life onto the setting. There's a refusal to be inspired by any other cultures or styles that results in the movie being a homogeneous slop that only passes as fun on an uncritical first watch. The logic behind its universe is there in that it implies worldliness and therefore invites comparison to reality, though this is born of laziness rather than any cutting attempt at social satire. This brings us to Honex, the all-powerful megacorporation that controls the entire honey industry. Bees are worked to death, they're never given vacations, they're never allowed outside of the hive unless sanctioned by the company, and so on. It's incredibly poorly developed though. None of the questions you might have about who owns what are answered. What's the point of all this profiteering if everyone seems to be getting the same amount? Honex still has a clear narrative purpose though. To satirize and condemn our way of working.
We know that you as a bee have worked your whole life to get to the point where you can work for your whole life.
This criticism of work culture, which I will lovingly term the honey trap, really does get at the heart of why capitalism is so soul-crushing. Congratulations, you've made it out of the factory farm education system alive. Choose a terrible job at the monopoly company and work at it until you're dead. What's the outcome of this criticism though? Nothing. There's no point to it in the greater story. Zero. Because the happy ending is that the bees collectively renounce their newfound freedom and go back to working at Honex under the exact same labour conditions, contradicting everything that got Barry there in the first place. That he knows the exploitation of his labour and species is wrong, that he realises choosing one job for the rest of his life is insane, and most importantly his yearning for freedom, are all to be forgotten. We're supposed to discard the reasons the plot even happens in the first place, in favour of supporting the initial state of affairs. Why? Because the film argues that workers being legally entitled to the fruits of their labour makes them lazy, decadent, and unfulfilled, thus leading to the complete breakdown of the environment and therefore the end of the world. Functionally, a pro-exploitation message, and derived from the talking point that collective ownership of the means of production leads to no work being done at all, B-Movie says no middle ground exists between complete corporate rule and death by excess. Hey, wait a second. Doesn't the Western honeybee have a lifespan of only 30 to 60 days in summer, giving no time for the environment to get to the state it's in before all the characters die? You're really not supposed to turn your brain on when watching, which is shown through the incredibly surface-level universe that exists only for the plot. Even after the environmental collapse, New York taxi services and flights are still operating as normal, and nobody seems to care. Because we're not following the setup to its logical conclusion, we're throwing away rationality to serve the story. For instance, in the graduation ceremony scene, Barry and Adam get there by bee car, but there aren't nearly enough parking spaces to accommodate every bee that showed up. Assuming no alternative transport systems, it's impossible that this event would not require an enormous car park. While it's a fairly inconsequential detail, it nonetheless points to the lack of care being put forward. Why should we give a shit about anything in a movie if the movie doesn't even give a shit about itself? As for the characterization, it's clear the movie tries to portray the relationship between Vanessa and Barry as endearing. It failed. Everything about it is inappropriate, disturbing, and awful. They seem to be of comparable age relative to their lifespans, so they at least have one up on Jerry Seinfeld. By the way, he himself later apologized for this theme in the movie, because it was weird and bad, so that's something. Our main character is devoid of any real personality in the first act, something that is resolved in no way whatsoever by the end of the movie. We would expect that his questioning of the environment would lead to some kind of character development, some kind of wide-reaching conflict forcing him to grow, but the inherently low-stakes nature of the narrative prevents this. Barry discovering the horror and ecstasy of interspecies romance is the end within itself the movie pursues, but there's no sacrifice in the process. This love is cheap. He was disinterested in bee life from the very beginning, so him choosing his blank slate of a girlfriend over constant work is obvious, and in fact requires him not to change. Had Barry begrudgingly accepted his exploitation, had he conformed, had he not gone into the real world, this romance could have been avoided. Hun-exploitation, which is, remember, the ideal state of affairs, would have been preserved. Bees wouldn't have stopped pollinating and become decadent. The environment wouldn't have collapsed. Billions of lives wouldn't have been lost. Just for this horrible relationship? Remember, he doesn't sacrifice the environment for love. He accidentally destroys the environment because the lawsuit was a horrible mistake. To say the plot is artificial is a grave understatement. It has to surgically remove Barry from his place in the world and smear him across Vanessa to secure a happy ending. Humans have essentially no agency whatsoever, acting merely as pawns for the plot. Vanessa is pretty and nice, and that's it. Where's the clash of personality that makes us emotionally invested? No action scenes hold any tension whatsoever because only the illusion of consequence is given. We are given ex machina after ex machina. None of the alleged close calls feel like it whatsoever, due to the lack of attention being paid to pacing, plus the tone being so ostentatiously goofy, makes it impossible to really engage with it as a viewer. Is there any time when Barry does something smart to get him and his friends to safety? This creates the effect of the movie feeling like it's being driven by some external force. The character's merely leaves blowing in the wind. In reality, it's all orchestrated by the idiot god Jerry Seinfeld. The film is self-aware in all the wrong places, forgetting that a plot needs to be coherent for it to be interesting. I will caveat this by saying it's fairly entertaining to the adult viewer, but that's largely down to the sheer volume of off-color jokes. It's not good. The humor should be the icing on the cake, not the cake, icing, and decoration. If it wasn't a children's movie, none of the humor would land. It abuses the trope of adult jokes in kids' movies to such an extent that it's almost devoid of jokes that children would be able to understand. This is a movie for adults that's masked as a kids' movie to hide the weak writing. This is exemplified by the B. Larry King segment, possibly the laziest decision in the whole movie, and that's saying something. The idea for this scene started and ended at, what if we got Larry King in this movie? And the thinking stopped there. What's a child gonna enjoy about that? The reliance on references is present throughout. The cover of Here Comes the Sun is ear-bleedingly poor, overproduced, and steals everything that makes the original song so heartwarming for an emotionally manipulative ending. Animation is an artistic medium with almost limitless potential, though due to its expense and laboriousness, it must work within a lot of restrictions. B-Movie's budget of $150 million gave almost infinite scope of imagination to the filmmakers. It's clear, though, Seinfeld just wanted to fart around and make a bunch of B-jokes, a massive insult to the hard-working animators in particular, who had to toil making this crap. Important though it may have been to your childhood, it's difficult to defend the end product artistically, at least to me. Product truly is the word for it, little more than a commodity to be bought and sold. It doesn't feel like a labor of love, it feels like money made this film. bee money is mentioned twice in the movie.
What do you think he makes?
Not enough.
Barry, why don't you use the stairs? Your father paid good money for those.
The latter implies that the father has control over the family's funds, or is at least the one making major financial decisions. This is inseparable from the fact that bee society is heavily gendered. Barry's mother is never once implied to have worked. Strange, considering they talk a lot about his dad's occupation being a stirrer. The fact that the system of money is so undeveloped is because they cannot take it to its logical extent without the whole thing falling through the floor. Why would bees need or want money at all? For BVs? For nicer cars? For luxurious stairs? Of course, money is only mentioned in passing, but its presence points back to the aforementioned issue of the utter lack of creativity present here. Money only exists for the bees because money exists for us. They could have had a sprawling bee culture with ways alien to us, but also understandable. But no, bee corporation, bee gender, bee car culture, bee military-industrial complex. The movie has an extraordinarily 1950s understanding of reality. The technology they have, the assigned gender roles, the work ethic. It's here when Jerry Seinfeld's dictatorial control over the project becomes clear. This is his vision, and his vision is god-awful. He knows how to make a comedy show that used to be funny, but his imagination ends there. His lack of experience led him to create something safe, so he decided to project his childhood onto a big-budget animated film. The results aren't pretty. The others working on this movie, such as Hans Zimmer, try to inject some liveliness and energy into this goddamn train wreck, but it just doesn't work. The score is generally competent, but there's just so much of it. The music feels like it's there to replace emotion and entertainment value instead of accentuating them. The color palette is so full of yellow, it's like the movie's pissing into your eyes, and it just looks boring. Just because the fuzz looks very graphics doesn't mean that it's well done. It's really difficult to pin down how this world actually works, because the film itself doesn't know. It constantly breaks its own already flimsy rules. Like, it utterly demonizes beekeeping as a practice for no reason. Why? The film has to maintain that Honex is not exploitative, but beekeeping is. And it can't because that's not true. So it just goes all in on the beekeepers are ontologically evil angle. It's an unbelievably stupid way of making a point. If you portray a certain part of the population as evil, you are a loser, and more importantly, that does not actually count as justification for an opinion. The real evil, according to the movie, that Barry literally goes to court to fight against, is humans taking honey that is not willingly given. But that's the rub. Honex seems to be doing the exact same thing, but the film pulls out the utterly insane trump card of being worked to death is completely optional, actually. Barry can just fuck off out the hive with the caveat that he is given permission by the military. Therefore, it seems like bees are straight up willingly choosing to be worked to death. Since they produce more honey than they need, it's fine that humans take some for themselves, right? Wrong. And I'll tell you why. Because beekeepers are sordid people who have no respect for anything but money. If Honex are working the bees in an organic hive like Barry's to death, where's all the excess honey going? They don't use it all. Are there big honey tanks guarded with bee guns? B-Movie seems completely oblivious to the injustice required to keep a top-down economic system like this running, and treats bees being worked to death not as a greed-stricken form of violence, but as a necessary evil. It fails to observe anything about its world to be wrong because it narcissistically focuses on the main character's journey, all else being left behind. They're happy to be worked to death so long as they don't have to undergo the horrific fate of not being exploited. When the bees are allowed to keep their honey that humans stole, they immediately stop working. Later on though, they realize they do want to keep making honey. The problem seems to be with the working to death part. Could the bees not continue working and share their honey under fairer working conditions? Of course not. The movie cut the proposed scenes with the queen bee, even though it seems like it would be a vital part of a movie about bees. It's far more important to say socialism sucks through a lengthy legal trial and last-minute apocalypse than to say anything of substance. Absolutely baffling conclusion. There is no development. We are supposed to believe that the horrible life bees have is awesome. Not for Barry though, because he's super special. Why is he exempt from the honey mines again? Because he broke the one rule of not talking to humans, caused an environmental crisis, and also managed to completely ruin honey production? If I was a bee, I would want him ripped limb from limb, or at least sent to bee prison. By the very fact nothing fundamentally changes in the end, it does not follow that Barry's life fundamentally changes. What's to stop the next loser bee from doing the exact same thing Barry did? Repeating the cycle over and over? Is it meant to serve as a cautionary tale? And if so, why does he get everything he ever wanted at the end? Doesn't matter. The world ceases to exist once the credits roll. This thing is completely miserable. There's so much to criticize but so little to analyze, because the source material is so flimsy. Do not accept the excuses that it's just a silly children's movie, or that it's not meant to be understood on a deeper level, because it's not meant to be understood at all. You should not accept $230 million being spent on something that is such an insult to your intelligence. I'm glad that it's gone down in history as a meme. Drivel, whose comedic value derives only from its tone-deaf weirdness. Its social critiques fall flat, its serious moments are laughable, and the humour is weak to the core. B-Movie's name suggests it to be an amateurish passion project whose constraints are mainly a matter of funding. Nothing could be further from the truth. The pure joy of making movies is completely absent. It's a meaningless, ego-driven pile of shite.